Okay, how are my friends out there in TV land, History 101 land? Anyway, the way I've been doing it is I do History 101 stuff, and then I do History 102 stuff, and I get back to History 101, so it's been a while since I've embraced History 101, but I'm back here and ready to talk to you guys again. I just want to always keep a little bit of connection to everybody out there. So, quick run through of all the wonderful students in my History 101 Monday, Wednesday class. So, Nayeli, Ariana, Taylor, Ashmeet, Parmeet, Colin, Joshua, Kaylin, Jamie, Alyssa, Dylan, Lynn, Mateo, Justin, Sky, Emily, Javier, David, Priscilla, Noah, Jacob, Christina, Nicholas, Natalie, James, Christian, Madeline, Luis, Mario, Kennedy, Zachary, Nathan, Josh, Stephen, Melissa, Brianna, Shochi, or Shochil, I still don't know how to say it exactly, Juan, I can never flip the page very fast, sorry about that, Martin, Janice, Cecilia, Toshi, Aaron, hey everybody, hope you guys are doing okay out there. I want you to think a lot about everybody, wonder about everybody, you can't just email me or contact me to ask me questions, but sometimes I feel like just tell me how you're doing, and that'd be kind of fun for something to know. Okay, so the American Revolution is over, of course, and now America has to begin to embrace the reality that it is an independent country. So the topic that we are now about to enter into is called the creation of the American Republic, And this technically begins the third and final section of History 101 for you guys, just in case you're keeping tabs on that kind of situation, all right? Now, one thing that's really interesting to me is that there is only one thing in American history that I am required by law to do, and I think this is part of what we call Title V of the California Educational Code. And that is that in the History 101 class, and to a degree in History 102 also, I am required to teach you the history and development of the Constitution of the United States. Now the rest of it, what I kind of like is, it's kind of left to the individual instructor, and everyone does it in their own kind of interesting and unique way. But the one thing that we have to do, of course, is we have to address the Constitution. Now, I've always wondered what would happen if I didn't, if I didn't do that. Would all of a sudden the educational police come in here, and would they handcuff me and arrest me? And the joke works so much better when I'm in front of my entire class, But I always think, wouldn't that be disturbing to all the students, of course, if they saw me arrested? But probably not. They'd probably think it was hilarious. They'd pull out their phones. They would make a little post of it. My history teacher got arrested. Ha, LOL, that kind of thing. Anyway, I am required to do this, and of course I am going to do it because I think it's important. If you are a citizen of the United States, if you're living here, of course, in any kind of extended way, understanding the Constitution of the United States seems to me to be a fundamental thing. And it's not just, of course, what the Constitution means on a daily basis, but it's what the Constitution, where it comes from. What is the origin? What is the history of this particular document? And all through American history is replete with important references to and moments where the Constitution becomes a very critical kind of thing. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to see how the Americans began to establish the government. And one thing I would just say, I'll build this more, is that the issue wasn't really the building of the states. The states were kind of a done deal. All the colonies had to do was kind of change the letterhead. Letterhead means, the top of the letter when you send out an official document. So instead of saying the colony of Massachusetts, it's now the state of Massachusetts. Almost all of the major questions and issues, the states were just sort of there and functional from the very beginning. I told you the colonies were virtually self-governing, and now they're actually self-governing, right? And through their own independence. The question wasn't so much the creation of the states, which that was done relatively quickly and relatively easily. The larger question was the nation, the government of the nation, and this was the one where we see, there are some issues that have to be overcome, and there's some trial and error that becomes part of the story. So, the focal point really of the presentation is, not all the governments of the United States, and the states were actually relatively easy to construct, but rather, how did they create the national government, the federal government of the United States of America? That becomes kind of the major historical question. Okay. So the way I'm going to deal with this is, it's kind of like the way that I deal with, my wife and I deal with things like, if we want to go out to eat. And I have to tell you, so one night we're tired, we want to go out to eat, and I have to tell you, that's one of the things I really miss right now. I just want to go get some tacos. I just want to go to, I don't know how you guys are feeling. Maybe some of you are doing it, and if you're doing it, just be safe and sane, okay? The thing I would hate more than getting the disease is maybe giving it to somebody, that'd be horrible, of course, especially if that became really problematic for that individual. So I hope you guys are keeping yourselves safe and being sane about the situation. But whenever, like we get to that point where we don't want to cook dinner, we want to go out, we do this process kind of. And it usually starts with where we don't want to go, like, oh, should we go get Mexican? Oh, we had Mexican last night, let's not do that. What about Italian? Well, no, I don't feel like Italian today. What do you think about Mediterranean? We're going through a list of things until we finally find out, yeah, let's go get pizza or something like that, that could be that outcome. So I'm going to kind of do that as far as the Americans are concerned relative to their government, the government they're going to create. So I'm going to start with what they didn't want. The Americans were pretty clear, on things that they didn't want in terms of what this government was going to be. So one thing they clearly didn't want, I'm sure you guys can guess this one, is they didn't want it to be a monarchy. They saw monarchies, and of course this is their recent history, their dealings with King George III, they're dealing with Great Britain. Monarchies were arbitrary, monarchies tended towards a tyranny, and these were clearly things that they didn't want. There were a couple voices supporting monarchy in America. It's kind of intriguing, and some of them, like, let's make George Washington George the First or something, but those are really muted, and that's not, those are outliers essentially. The primary notion was, we don't want a monarchy. Monarchy has been discredited as far as they're concerned. So one thing they're clearly not going to do is they're not going to establish a monarchy. But there were other kind of just issues. They didn't want a government that was too strong. For them, power was problematic. All Americans thought that power was corruptive. Absolute power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So they didn't want a government that was too strong. They wanted to make sure that, of course, the liberties of the individual people were protected absolutely. They didn't want a government that was too centralized. Centralization is just a way to create power. When you centralize the power in one person, a monarchy, a dictator, of course, they can do extreme kind of things. So, a way to safeguard against that is to decentralize the government, to spread it out. And so that became kind of the general attitude. We need to avoid the centralization that might take place. They didn't want a government that felt too distant, That's kind of the way they felt about Great Britain. Those governments were, that government was far away, Parliament was far away, the king was far away, and it felt distance them. And like you and I think even today, we want our government to feel close. We want to be able to touch it. We want to be able to talk to it if we possibly can. So these were things that the Americans clearly didn't want. They didn't want their government to feel, they didn't want to be tyrannical, they didn't want to be too strong, they didn't want it to be too distant. They wanted to feel close, they wanted to feel in touch with their governments, all right? Now, one other intriguing thing that they didn't want was they didn't want what the Greeks would have called a government demokratia. Now, demokratia, two words, demos, people, and kratia, rule. And so the ancient Greeks in Athens had created a democracy. And it was, it's very little in this regard. It's the people of Athens and really the adult men of Athens. It's always going to be relative. Someone's not going to get to be involved. And women were not involved, slaves were not involved, aliens were not involved. But the adult men, those who were citizens of the polis of Athens, they were the governing apparatus. It means the people rule, and that's very literal. And when they, if you would have seen it in Athens, they had what they called the ecclesia, and the eligible population would gather together. I think at some point it was like 35,000 people. And there would be those who would kind of lead the debate and discussion. I think they called them demagogues. And then there would be votes on the things that were issues. It's direct. The people are ruling. They're making the decision at that moment. And I think that they voted on shards of clay that they would make their mark upon and then put it into a bigger pot of clay, and then someone would have to kind of count that all up. So, there is a form of government called democracy. And the Americans reject the concept of democracy. And kind of two things that are going on here. They didn't think it was practical. You could do that maybe in a city-state that had whatever population, probably 200,000 or something for Athens. I don't know the population, forgive me. You could do that with 35,000 eligible individuals, but how could you do it when there were hundreds of thousands of eligible voters? How would you bring them all together, especially in their kind of situation? So it seemed impractical. Today, how could we do that, right? I don't know how many voters there are in America, but I think it's around 150 million eligible people or something like that, And how could you have an ecclesia, an assembly of all those particular people? Now, of course, having said that, you could, right? With our modern technology, we would all have access together through some kind of giant Zoom conference or something like that, of course, and we could all hear the point. One of the big issues though would be like discussion. So you want to make a statement, of course, as a member of the general democracy, and you put your button on or you click on something and say you want to speak. and you find out that you're 100,010 in the line or something like that, and your speaking time will be a month from now. So there are some impractical issues, but we can clearly do the voting issue with no problem whatsoever. Fingerprinting, retinal identification. Every morning you wake up, you see that there are things that we should vote upon. You vote upon them. There's parts of how democracy in the modern technological world could actually work, but from the point of view of the Americans creating their republic, democracy seemed like it wouldn't work. It was impractical. And furthermore, they didn't absolutely trust the people. I mean, that's one of the major issues here. You have to kind of trust the people to rule. And I have my own interesting mixed emotions about this. I mean, there are times when I don't trust the people necessarily. And the populist movements that express themselves and are expressing themselves right now, we see that populism can equate to racism, and populism can equate to conspiracy theory notions, and populism can equate to attacking minority elements, of course, even though there's no particular reason to do that kind of thing. There's a book that's written about kind of the emerging democracy. And understand that in America, whenever we say democracy, we don't mean it's the actual form of government, because the actual form of government is a republic. We simply mean the participation of the people. The more democratic we are, the more involved we are. The less democratic we are, the less involved we are. Anyway, but when there's a book on the rise of American democracy, and it just the level of involvement of the American people and their feeling of connection, and this would have been from the time of the Revolution on towards the Civil War, a book written by Sean Wilentz. And the argument is that the more democratic America became, the more emotional politics became, the more irrational politics became. And it's one of those kind of problematic things. We seem to lose our rationality, our discerning kind of qualities when we get involved in the mob. The mob begins to emerge essentially. And so there is kind of a level of distrust of democracy. So regardless of the value of the concept of democracy, the Americans didn't want to have one. I mean, that's not what they're going to have either, okay? So these are the things they didn't want. They didn't want a monarchy, they didn't want tyranny, they didn't want a centralized, distant, overly strong government, they didn't want democracy. So the question then becomes, what did they want? What did they want? Well, what they wanted, and I'm going to employ the Latin here, is a government res publica, a government res publica. Now, this is Latin, and the last word, publica, is pretty easy for us, right? That's the public or the people. Res is a little more complicated, and I think it would probably be best interpreted as an affair of the public, an affair of the public. And what I would like to just suggest to you is, let's go with the triad that was presented by Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So the government is an affair of the people. Now, it isn't direct democracy, it's not democracy, right? But it is based upon the people, and the people then elect their representatives, and their representatives rule. And those representatives are responsible to the people, and the people, of course, can remove them from office if they want. They expect their government to always be paying attention to what the people want, essentially. So this became the notion. The government that they're going to establish for themselves, of course, is the government res publica, or as we say in English, a republic. The government of the United States of America is a republic. That is actually like a citizenship test. What is the government of the United States? The government of the United States was a republic. Now, as they instituted the former republic, and note that I use the Latin words, they were historically aware of, the history of the republic. The concept was invented by the Romans, somewhere in the 500 BC area, towards the end of that 500 whatever, 506 or something like that. The Romans established this republic, which they will endure for the better part of 500 years. So there's a history there. And the Americans, of course, recognized the Roman connections to the republic in instituting something like the Senate. The Senate was the republican body of the Roman Republic. The Americans were very aware of kind of history, and especially what had happened to the Romans. So if you guys know the story a little bit, the Romans established a republic, and that endures for a long time. But that republic it was just the city of Rome, really, and then it began to expand over Italy, and then beyond that, of course, and it became larger and larger, and more powerful and powerful. And it became super large and super powerful. Of course, it all corrupted the republic, and the republic ultimately degrades and transforms itself into the empire, the Roman Empire, with emperors like Augustus and stuff like that. So, this was a lesson that the Americans these were things the Americans really knew from history. And so for them it was kind of a lesson, like a cautionary tale about, what do you do when you make a republic? So one idea that they were very keen on was the fact that republics were best when they were small. Small republics were the best way to go. Big republics, powerful republics become problematic. By the way, we live in a very big and powerful republic, and you all know that, I don't want to absolutely it's still here, it's hanging in there, but it's a troubled big republic. We all know that there's some truth here, that the bigger, the more powerful it gets, the more problematic it can become. So one thing that was really just in the minds of the Americans as they established their republics was that it was best when they were small. And so this has a kind of reinforcing impact upon the Americans. They believe that the primary expression of the republic, or the concept of the republic in America, should be the states. The primary thing that they're going to focus on, their attention on in the very beginning, are the states. The states both fit the model of small republics. They're kind of perfect in that particular regard. And I think maybe the more important thing was that the states were so much more familiar to the Americans. Those colonies had never technically been associated with each other, right? Their only technical connections were between themselves and Great Britain. But there was no technical connection necessarily between, let's say, Georgia and Massachusetts. And they're not even neighbors necessarily. And it is intriguing to me that as the Americans perceive themselves in these early years, they tend to perceive themselves, more as Virginians or people from Massachusetts. I always wonder how you're supposed to do that. Massachusetts, you can't do that, of course. New Jersey, New Yorkers, that works okay. New Jerseyites, everyone's North Carolinians and South Carolinians, those all work. But that's the way they perceive themselves. They identified with their state much more than they identified with the larger entity, the nation, if you will. Okay, this was something that was not very functional to them. It wasn't a major idea for them. So we have then, in the very beginning of the establishment of the Republic, I'm going to call it a state focus. I mean, the states really were kind of the most important thing. And it's presented to us in so many ways. Note the name of the country. We are the United States of America. And the noun is states. We are the states. It always sounded so funny to me when I would hear someone say that, like Mexico, or, oh, you're from the States, it just sounds weird to me, all right? But that's very true. That's what we are. United is the adjective. America is just describing location. The United States, we are the states. And it's not just that our nation is technically the states, that's who we are, okay? But think of our flag. Our flag is all about states. 13 stripes representing 13 original states. 50 stars representing the 50, the states are critical. The states are the issue. And in the beginning, the states were everything as far as the Americans were concerned. So their understanding of republics, that they were best when they were small, their identification, their primary identification with their state, meant that when they were thinking about creating a governing apparatus, they're going to focus almost all of their attention on the states. And one reason this is just important to note is that, we don't do that anymore. We focus our attention increasingly on the nation. It took a long time for that to happen. I don't know if you guys know, but up until the Civil War, when you said the United States, you would use the plural. The United States are doing this. And the Civil War then becomes like this. I mean, it's so ironic, of course. It's a rendering of the nation, but it's establishment of a sense of nationalism and national unity. And from that point on, we now call the United States it's an entity. We see that as an entity. But up until that time, the United States are, all these individual states kind of doing their thing in their own particular kind of way. But clearly in the very beginning, the focus was primarily on the states. They were, they could identify with the states, of course, and it fit their notions of the historical model that small states are the way to go. So this focus on the small states, it colors the way they're going to perceive their creation of a nation. Now, they knew they had to do this. In the moment of the Declaration, it's just absolute pragmatism. Each colony could not fight a war against Great Britain. But if they joined together, of course, as the United States, then they could. I mean, that's the primary thing that's happening. They're declaring their united opposition to Great Britain, and also allying each other with each other, allying them together. So they realized that basic necessity meant that they had to come together, at least to some degree, okay? Understand the states are always going to be preeminent in their minds at that moment, but they realized they did have to come together to some degree. And we have this kind of sense that there needs to be some kind of unifying entity. So what we see is the state focus, but with a need to come together. And that need to come together is reflected in the original national government of the United States of America, and that is something called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. This is the very first government of the United States of America. It will endure basically from about 1777 to around 1789, when the new regime begins to come into play. But this is our very first government, okay? Now, the Articles of Confederation is simply what it says it is. It is a series of articles. So these are paragraph statements. I can't remember exactly how many there are. I should know. It's like 11 or something like that, okay? And these are just sort of defining this government, this national government, you know, how it's going to function. And one thing that I want you to know that it says in the articles, which I find very interesting and telling, is that it describes this entity as a league of friendship. It sounds kind of to me like the United Nations, right? These states realizing that they need to kind of work together with each other, come together in a league of friendship to be more effective, basically. But it kind of shows us that you're still sort of, you know, everything about this government is going to show us the state focus, that the states are always going to be the most important thing. But the Articles of Confederation is the very first attempt. If you want, you can call this like, you know, the first trial. Though I don't think that it was perceived that way in the very beginning. They thought this would be the governing apparatus, the way it was going to work out. Now we know, with our historical 2020 hindsight, that this will not be the ultimate government of the United States, but understand as they implement this, they really thought that this was the way that they should go. So what I want to do is describe for you the Confederation government, all right? So what it was, basically, and remember that the states are always going to be the most important thing, it was simply a Congress, okay? And I'm going to describe the Congress to you just because it's meaningful for the long run, as a unicameral Congress. Now, unicameral simply means one chamber. And the only reason I would say that to you, of course, is because ultimately the Congress of the United States is bicameral, or two chambers. So I'm just trying to make this particular point at this moment. This is a unicameral legislature. So, in the beginning it was the Continental Congress. Over time, it just simply became the Congress, and this was the government of the United States of America. Now, if you want to perceive the Congress, then just perceive what our class would have looked like in the good old days. You guys remember the good old days when you and I got to sit together in the classroom together? How fun was that, okay? Anyway, but so you guys out there in the class, you would be the representatives from the various states, and just for fun, I would be the presiding officer. And you can call me president if you want, but I'm not really. I'm just the presiding officer over the Congress. And it's my job to make sure that parliamentary procedure is adhered to, that we run the thing in the particular kind of way. So, what would the Congress have looked like? It would look like a room with a bunch of men in there, of course. I'd have to tell you, they're white men at that time, with one guy up in front doing some talking and guiding it, and a whole bunch of other people kind of involved in it. So, kind of a very simple image of what's going on here. Now, the Congress was made up of the representatives of the individual states, and the states could send anywhere from 2 to 7 representatives depending upon the size of the state. So a small state like Rhode Island would have 2 representatives, and a larger state like Virginia would have 7 representatives. But you have to understand that there's always going to be the focus on the sovereignty of the individual states. So that even though some states had more representatives, when they voted, it was 1 vote per state, 1 vote per state. So, part of me wonders then, okay, what difference does it make if you have 2 representatives or 7? And the only thing I can tell you is it's voices, right? More voices. So like if you're, 7 Virginians are screaming for something versus, 2 people from Rhode Island screaming for the opposite side of the whole thing. In the end, though, this is an absolute expression of the sovereign status of the individual states. Whenever they voted about anything, it was 1 vote per state. So there's only 13 votes in the Congress. That's how many votes they're going to be, and that's the way they wanted. They wanted to protect the sovereign status of the individual states. So So they're creating a government, and of course, just to do what they want, to maintain some kind of a united entity, they had to give the Congress some kind of power. So I want to highlight some of the powers that Congress was given. One power that Congress was given was to deal with all disputes between the states. So if the states were having a problem with each other, Virginia and Maryland had an issue or something like that, then Congress could be the arbitrator that try to ameliorate that particular dispute. Okay, so one thing the Congress did was to deal with disputes between the states. They also gave the Congress the power over Indian affairs. They thought it was a good idea to have a centralized kind of entity that would confront the issues of the Native Americans and deal with them. So Congress was in charge of Indian affairs. Congress was also given charge of foreign affairs. So they thought, again, kind of a united expression of the policies of the United States. Patty? I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. The mailman's here, and I wanted to make sure some letters got out. Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you at all. Okay. No big issue. Anyway, he looks like he's dropping off a package. Okay, so Congress was given power over foreign affairs. Sorry to bring you guys into our domestic situation. Anyway, power over foreign affairs, right? So, it's something that does make sense, right? A unified front as the America confronts the rest of the world. Congress was also given the power to establish money. Again, just a basically practical kind of thing, that there should be one currency in America that would be shared by all the individual states. It seemed like to make sense in many ways, okay? So that was another power that was given to Congress. But the main thing I want you guys to know is that Congress had very little power whatsoever. Congress had no administrative ability whatsoever. So there's Congress, but there's nothing else, and so that meant that Congress could make a law, but the only way the law would be enforced was if the states would enforce it. The states become the administrative entity over any law that would be created by Congress. Congress was also not given any judicial power. So that means, and tragically for you guys, I wrote this one because I messed up and didn't show it to my wife, didn't give any judicial power. So if Congress passed a law and there was a legal issue, if it was going to be adjudicated, that would be left up to the states. The states had the judicial systems they would have to deal with this. And it sounds problematic, but that's exactly what the states wanted, essentially. And then finally, one of the things that just is stunning to me in many ways is the Congress had no power of taxation. Under the Articles of Confederation, taxation was basically voluntary. And of course, I always wanted, wouldn't it be fun if that was the way it always was, right? Voluntary taxation. So that means on the moment before, on April the 14th, when you were contemplating paying your income tax, well, it's voluntary, I don't know about you, but if it was voluntary, it would take me 1 nanosecond to think, I don't think I'm going to pay it this year, maybe next year, something like that, okay? The reality was that Congress was endlessly begging for money. Congress was bankrupt, or not, they were paupers. They were struggling for money almost all the time, essentially. And this sounds problematic. No administrative component, no judicial component, no ability to tax. But we need to understand that this was all done by design. The Americans wanted their states to be the center of the Republican experience. And so they constructed for themselves essentially an extraordinarily weak national apparatus. And, it's not a mistake, right? Though we understand ultimately, historically, at least it will be perceived as a mistake, that it will have some level of dysfunction. So, what I want to do is kind of just give you a little picture of the Confederation government in just 2 ways. And I want to tell you about their strengths. There were certain things the Confederation government did that we have to give them their propers, okay? But as you can imagine, the thing that I will highlight for you are the weaknesses associated with the Confederation government, and would ultimately, of course, cause some Americans to seek a change. I'm going to make that a break right now, and I'll come back to you in just a bit.